We're about to jump into writing code, but first I want to talk about if this course is right for you. So if you're interested in learning how to code and you've never written JavaScript before, then this course is for you. There is a certain myth today that you can only be a programmer if you look a certain way, have a certain gender, or have a certain degree from a certain college. Yet this is becoming more and more of a debunked myth as we see so many different people get jobs as developers from all sorts of backgrounds and without degrees or with different kinds of degrees. For myself, I taught myself to code using tons of different online resources and then got my first job as a developer. For JavaScript in particular, I took Udemy courses, Udacity courses, Treehouse courses, Front-End Masters courses, West Boss courses, all sorts of different online courses just like this one to teach myself how to code, build a portfolio, and then get my first job as a developer. So if you are on the fence whether or not you are someone who can learn how to code, just know that anyone can learn how to code. You just need the passion for it and the grit and the determination to keep learning and push through when you get stuck sometimes. So keep this in mind as you go along the course. This is hard stuff. It's hard for everyone in the beginning, but if you stick with it and keep learning, you will get there. With that being said, let's dive in and start writing some code. Okay, here's a quick setup for our course. Now we definitely need Google Chrome installed on our computer. And Google Chrome is going to be really useful to us because it's a great way to debug at times. So Google Chrome has the JavaScript console as a developer tool. If we go up here to these three dots and we go into more tools and then we look at developer tools, we can go into here and we immediately see the console. We immediately see different things that are coming to handy for us when we want to see what is going on with our app. So first of all, if we look into the elements, of course we can see all of the HTML and the CSS on this page. And if you're familiar with some HTML and CSS, then you know about how this works already when you can go around and change different things. Of course, these only show up for you, but you can see all of the settings here. The JavaScript console is a great way to see different ways of debugging, as we'll learn about in the course a little bit. And you can also execute JavaScript right here. We can write our first bit of code right here, the famous hello world. Because this is the console, we're logging something to the console. So we want to write out words and have them appear back to us. And we can do the famous hello world. And there we see that it's output back to us. So any sort of JavaScript that we want to do, we can do in here. For instance, we can create a variable of somebody's age. So var age equal 30, and we can save it. And then if we want to see the value of that variable, we want to find out what is inside of age, what is that age, then we can simply write out age, and the age will come back to us. So as we can see, the JavaScript console is going to be really useful to us. And another thing we want to download is the Sublime text editor. No, it is not this band, but it is Sublime, the text editor that we use for writing our code in. There are many different sorts of text editors, but Sublime is definitely considered one of the best. Make sure you have this downloaded. And this is going to be really handy because when you do have this downloaded, you can go find it on your computer, open it up, and start writing code inside of it. That is all the setup we're going to need for this course. Let's go on to the next section. We're about to jump into writing code. But first I want to talk about why we're learning what we're learning. We are going to be learning about asynchronous JavaScript. When we build the app at the end of the course, the Game of Thrones themed app, the whole point of building the app is to get a good understanding of asynchronous JavaScript. It's a huge part of JavaScript, and so if you can understand this fundamental concept as a beginner, I think that really helps. Wrapping my own mind around asynchronous JavaScript was a huge part of me getting JavaScript and having JavaScript click for me. No matter what stage you are as a developer, whether you are a very junior developer or a senior developer, you are always going to be interacting with asynchronous JavaScript because it's such an enormous part of how JavaScript works. That's why we're learning that part. Now, in order to do this and build our app, we're going to be using a couple of different things here. We're going to be learning Jquery, which is a JavaScript library. We're going to be building an Ajax request and talking about Ajax requests, and then we're going to be using DOM handlers and talking about how we select elements by IDs and how we manipulate the DOM to make things change on our app screen. Now, that is towards the end of the course. In the beginning and middle of the course, we're going to be learning something called vanilla JavaScript. Before, we just saw the library Jquery, and we talked about Ajax requests and DOM handlers, and that stuff is not vanilla JavaScript. What vanilla JavaScript is pure JavaScript. It's just JavaScript without any libraries or frameworks or extra stuff. It's JavaScript with just objects and functions and how variables work. And we're going to try to emphasize in the middle section of this course all about learning vanilla JavaScript and solidifying the fundamentals of vanilla JavaScript. Let's talk a little bit about why I think it is so important to learn vanilla JavaScript and why we're learning it. So JavaScript used to be only a front-end language. For a front-end developer, you need to know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. One of the greatest ways I've heard it described is from many professors and teachers and developers over at Udacity. And they talk about how when it comes to your front-end development, you can view your app like a house. So your HTML can be the walls of your house. The CSS can be like the paint or the style, so the color of the wall. And lastly, the JavaScript is the interactive part of your house. So it's when you turn on that remote control and you click something on your television, it's that interactivity, and the logic behind that, the code and the JavaScript you write, is what makes things interactive on your site. It's what makes things happen, and that's the real power is of JavaScript. But if you've heard of Node and you're wondering what that is, Node is for the back end. The back end of your site deals a lot with interacting with the database. So you're a user and you go onto a site and you save your name and your password and your email address. All of that stuff goes over into the database. The backend is a way for you to write an app that interacts with the database and brings your browser everything it needs. So later on, you log onto that website and your username and your password and your email have all been stored on that website. So Node is just JavaScript. What this really means is JavaScript is a full stack language. You can use JavaScript to build an entire app. It can be used on the front end, or if you want to be a back-end developer, you can go and use JavaScript on the back end with Node. As we can see here, Node is built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine, which used to be just in the browser, but now can be used on the server side. The reason why we're learning vanilla JavaScript is when you go and you learn about Node and Express and all of these back-end things, your deep understanding of JavaScript and how it works just without anything else, just JavaScript, can serve you really well when you're learning about Node. Another one you might have heard of is Angular. So Angular is another framework and it's used on the front end, so you can write part of your application in a beautiful front end and just use pure JavaScript. But things like Angular were created to make your life easier as a JavaScript developer. It's a neater and some consider more efficient way to write your JavaScript, but you have to learn a lot of different things besides just JavaScript. Another one that we've heard of is React. Now, React is a really popular JavaScript library for building front-end applications. And this is where it gets pretty cool. One of the reasons everyone really loves React is because React is, a lot of it is just JavaScript. What this means is a lot of React is just vanilla JavaScript that we are going to be learning about in this course. Instead of having to learn so many different things that are different than JavaScript, everyone likes React because it uses a lot of pure JavaScript. And again, if we can understand the fundamentals of JavaScript on its own, you can take that knowledge of the language and then go and use it for whatever JavaScript frameworks you use. And this is why, as a beginner, I think it's so important to have a really good understanding of just pure JavaScript or vanilla JavaScript. This is going to be a fun introduction to JavaScript, so let's get started. This is a very quick update on this course. Since this course came out, I've gotten a ton of awesome feedback about how I can make this course even better. I want to hear from you. If you were going along this course and you feel, I wish there could have been one more example about scope, or, I wish this part could have been explained a little better, please let me know. You can leave your suggestion in a review, you can post your suggestion as a question, or you can privately message me. If you let me know about how I can help create the course that you really want, the course that's going to help you the most, I will most likely take your feedback and then go add on to the course or update the course and make it even better. This is not a course that I just threw up and then I'm going to leave it alone. I want to take in your opinion into account so that I can update this course continually and always make it better for you. I'm also going to be adding bonus sections as time goes on. If there is something you want to learn a bit about, I might add a bonus section about that thing. So please let me know, and if there's any way I can help you, just reach out and I am here. Let's get coding. Frequently as a developer, you are going to be creating variables and working with them all the time. So let's start writing variables and figure out what they are. Here I have my Sublime text editor open on the right, and over here on the left, I have actually opened up my Google Chrome browser, and I have opened up inside of it this variables starter HTML file you see here. On the right, you can see all of the HTML, and then on the left, you can see it open in my browser. Now, even though this is an HTML file, the browser knows that anything inside of these script tags is going to be JavaScript, and the browser will interpret it as such. This note here is just to remind us that everything inside of the script tag will be JavaScript and it'll be executed as JavaScript in the browser. And if you're wondering what these slashes are and why this is a color of gray here, these slashes signify a comment in your code. Now, you might be writing code at some point and you want to leave a note to yourself or you want to leave a note to another developer. And that is all these two slashes are. The browser ignores this comment, so once you write those two slashes, your browser will completely ignore this. Now we're about to provide out our variable, but first let's think, why do we even care about variables? Why are they important? Think about your favorite book or your favorite TV show. Maybe your favorite TV show is Game of Thrones. Now you see this picture, and you know that this is a picture of Daenerys. Or you see a HBO photo and you instantly recognize the girl with the white blonde hair and the one riding the dragon, you know it's Daenerys. So you say, hey, it's the mother of dragons, and you remember her name is Daenerys, right? But say you are writing a program or building an app. How do you get your app to remember the name of Daenerys? We can do this by using variables. Okay, so you know that her name is Daenerys. But how do we get our app to remember that? Let's create a variable called name, and we'll store the value inside as Daenerys. Let's write our variable, var name, and then the equal sign, Daenerys. Now, before we worry too much about what these quotes are, we're going to talk about those in the next section. Let's just look at this for 1 second. Now, this is an equal sign right here, but what this is really saying is we created a variable called name, and inside of that variable name is the value of Daenerys. And if you're wondering what this is right here, this is a semicolon, and we use these in JavaScript much like we use periods in the English language. Think about when you write a sentence and you want it to be over. This is over. You use a period. And to signify the end of a statement, you use a semicolon like we are right here. Now, let's just minimize this picture a little bit and move this a little. Now, our app can remember that the variable name has a value inside of it of Daenerys. Now, we can kind of prove this by using document.write, which will just write this out onto the screen, and putting it into a name. Now, we're going to save this, and then we're going to refresh the page. And now we see that this JavaScript was run, and we went into the value of our name variable, and we found that the value inside was Daenerys, and then we printed it to the screen. Now, our JavaScript was just executed. We went inside of this name variable and we found the value inside, which is Daenerys, and then we printed it out to the screen. We've told our app to remember that name has the value of Daenerys. Now let's go on to the next section and talk about variable types and then start writing some.
Simply looking for the answer and learning how to apply it and teaching yourself. So let's pause this for a second and go over to Google and just type in Sublime, turn turn off autocomplete. And we can go down here. I have already been here, but we can go on Stack Overflow, which is a great place for developers to go to write questions about programming, helping others, and answering questions. So here there's a little overview of someone wanting to turn this off, and then we have the answer. I'm going to skip over a few steps like where to go, but I already know that from previous experience that we're going to go into our Sublime user settings, so our own settings about how we want our text editor to look, act, and things that we want it to do. So let's go into Preferences, Settings. And in here we have our user settings, a couple of them that we already have, translate tabs to spaces is true, etc. We're just going to go in here and paste this in, save it, make sure it has that comma at the end. And then we're going to quit this and go back and try to rewrite this. And we can see now that it works. There is nothing popping up. No suggestions are on. Okay, now let's jump into actually talking about variable types. So there are different types of variables. There are strings, numbers, undefined, and booleans, and these are all different types or different kinds of variables. Let's start off with a string. So a string is just any set of characters. And we actually saw a string in the last section when we wrote the denarius variable. So we can rewrite that variable here, var name equal to denarius. And then put that semicolon at the end. That's like a period in the English language as we talked about. And we can save that. And the reason that this is a string is because we put quotations around it. So when we put quotations around this, we're saying this is a string. And that is a variable type just of any set of characters. So we could have var name2 equal to blah blah, and that's just any set of characters at all. Saved, and that is also a string surrounded by quotations. Real quick, if you're wondering why 2 is capitalized, or if you've seen this before, that's because JavaScript is camel case. And what all camel case means is when you are naming your variables, it is good to make the second word in your variable capitalized. So you have var name2 and the second word is capitalized. Say if you wanted more names in your variable, var name2 again, you would have this third word capitalized too, and that's called camel case. You can Google that if you want to look more into it, and just making sure you have that down as a best practice. Okay, so let's talk about numbers as another variable type. So numbers are a variable type, and they're a way that you can store numbers. If that sounds redundant, I'll just show you both of them. So let's create a variable age that is equal to how old is denarius. I'm actually not sure. Let's just say 21. And here we actually can get rid of the quotations. It's not a string, it's a number. So let's put age equal to 21 and save. Now this is saying that this is a variable age and it's equal to 21. And the type is a number because that is the number that we're storing inside. The variable type is undefined. This is when the value inside that variable is not defined. You just don't know what it is. So we can do that by saying city, booleans. So booleans are a value type that is true or false. And if that sounds confusing, let's just write one and we'll be able to look at it more visually. So let's just comment this out for a second so it doesn't appear on our screen. So let's create a variable named evil. And let's set it to, okay, do we think denarius is evil? No, definitely not. Let's set it to false. And now, if we write out the value on the screen of evil, what do you think is going to appear? Let's save and refresh our page. False. So evil has the value of false. And the variable type of evil is either true or false. It's a Boolean, which means that it can only ever have two values, either true or false. We can change this value and say true, and save it, and then the value will come to true. But it can only ever have one of two values, either true or false, as a Boolean. Let's go on to the next section and learn more JavaScript. So far we've been writing code that is always executed, or always run. But what if we want to write code that is only executed if a certain circumstance is true? Let's conceptualize this by thinking about if statements used in your everyday life. So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, and if not, this course might be really annoying to you since there's so many Game of Thrones pictures and stuff like that. But if you're a Game of Thrones fan and Game of Thrones is on, you watch. Now, an if statement is used to specify a block of code to be executed if a specified condition is true. And you can kind of apply this to your life by just looking at this example. If this specified condition is true, if Game of Thrones is on, you're gonna watch it. But only if this condition is true, then you perform this action, right? You watch Game of Thrones. In other words, if this specified condition is true, then you run this code or execute this code. But if this condition is false, you don't. That code does not get executed. Now, if we actually write the code, let's figure out what we want to do, and then think about how we could write it out, what the steps are involved in creating this if statement. This is sometimes called pseudo code. So before you start actually writing code, just think about what you're trying to do and different ways you can try to attack it, or what are the steps involved. Kind of creating your game plan before you start diving into code. That way it's easier to actually write your code than do. Okay, so here we have this variable name equal to denarius. Now let's do something where we want our browser to want words in the browser to say she is the third character. But we only want those words to appear on the screen if this name variable is equal to denarius. So this could be any sort of name, maybe it's entered on the screen, maybe it's just here, and when it's entered, if it's equal to denarius, then we want to know she's the third character. But if that variable name does not have the value of denarius, not equal to denarius, then we don't want to know. So let's just use some pseudo code by calling what we want to do. Definitely accomplish that goal or whatever program you want to write. But you're not actually writing the code, you're just writing the steps in the So let's actually write our if statement now. So if, and then we're going to put parentheses. Now anything inside these parentheses is the condition that we're checking if it's true. So if name is equal to denarius, then, and now we're going to write out some curly brackets. If it starts to look kind of scary, all these curly brackets mean is that anything inside these curly brackets is going to get executed, but only if this condition is true. So if the value of the variable name is equal to denarius, then whatever happens in here is going to happen. Then this happens. So So let's write what we actually want to happen if name is equal to Jquery. We want this text to appear on the screen that says, she is the mother of dragons. And there's our semicolon. Let's hit save. Here we actually need 2 equal bars. So save again. And here we can see, boom, it is now appearing on the screen. She is the mother of dragons. So what did this if statement do? This code was ran like this. If name is equal to Jquery, then write she is the mother of dragons. So this if statement went in and checked the value of name. It went into the variable name, it looked at the value, and it saw it is true. That is equal, Jquery is equal to Jquery. It's correct. So then, because it was true, it executed this. Now, what would happen if this was something else? So var name equals Jon Snow. Let's save it and run it. Now nothing is appearing on the screen. Why? Because our if statement checked the value of the name variable. It went and checked it, and it saw that it's Jon Snow, which is not equal to Jquery. So name does not equal Jquery, and so this line of code is not being run at all. And that's why it's not appearing on the screen. It only could have been run if this condition was true. That is an if statement, and that's why they are so powerful. Okay, we learned about if statements, and now here's a code challenge. So before, when we had Jquery up, let's just save this, hit Command Save, and then Command R and refresh the page. We saw that our if statement was going into the variable name, seeing that the value was Jquery's, and because name here is equal to Jquery's, the check came out confirmed. Yes, this is true. Then this code was run. So this code is running because this if statement was true. But we can see when we enter in Jon Snow and then hit save and then refresh the page, we can see that this code is no longer being run. So there is nothing being written out on the screen here because now our if statement again went into the variable name. It went inside and found that this was not true. Name is not equal to Jquery's now. And so nothing happened. This line of code was not run. But now we just have this blank empty screen. So what if there's a case where name is not equal to Jquery's, no code is run, and we want something else to happen now? Instead of just a blank screen showing up, we want something else to happen. So if name is equal to Jquery's, write she is the mother of dragons. But if not, or if else, write something else on the screen. So maybe we'll write, that person is not the mother of dragons. So we need a way for, if we go into here and find that this value is not equal to Jquery's, then we need a way for something else to print onto the screen to maybe let the user know, hey, she is not the mother of dragons. So knowing this, I want you to just go Google around and try to find how you would write this out here. If name is not equal to Jquery's, how would you print that out on the screen? And I think this is a great exercise to do because a lot of developers I really respect and admire talk about how one of the best ways to learn how to code is just to Google it and figure it out and really learn that way. So let's do it. Now go figure it out, write it out onto the screen, write it into your code, hit save, and then come back for the next lesson. Okay, so when trying to figure out how to add this next component into this if statement, we're going to go over and look at if statement documentation. So we can look here and see we're doing the first part of the statement. If this condition is true, then this block of code executes, this block of code inside the curly brackets. And if we keep scrolling, we can go on and find something else called the else statement. And the documentation says the else statement is used to specify a block of code to be executed if the condition is false. So this is exactly what we need right here. If name is something besides Jquery's, then we need this other code to execute. What we can even do is take this last part of what we need and copy it into here. So a lot of the times with documentation, you might need to look very closely
at the exact documents that you need to get some sort of code or module from. So maybe later on you will be able to write an if statement just completely on your own and not need to look up documentation perhaps. A lot of the times you'll need to get good at looking at the documentation, taking code from there, and putting it into your code and making it work with alterations. So let's go down there a bit more. We'll put this in a comment so we can just look at it and reference it. And we're going to write else and include the curly brackets again. Then press enter so we have a little bit of room. And now we can see that we're saying, if this is not true, if this condition is not true, then we're going to return whatever code is written in here. So if our name variable is not Denarius, then let's write something else. She is not the mother of dragons. Great, now let's hit save, and we can see that our variable name is equal to Jon Snow right now. So if we look at our code, we can see that if it works correctly, then we should actually see she is not the mother of dragons outputted onto the screen. So let's go back over to our HTML document and refresh the page. And we can see she is not the mother of dragons is now showing up. So now this if-else statement is complete. And if we did rewrite Denarius in here, saved it, and then read it again, we would see it is now saying she is the mother of dragons. So this if statement went in and checked what the variable name is, and then code is executed depending on what the value is inside of that variable. Now let's take a break and go on to the next section. Have you ever heard of object-oriented programming? Well, we're about to talk about it because JavaScript supports object-oriented programming. If you've never heard of object-oriented programming, you are about to find out. JavaScript supports object-oriented programming, and objects are really powerful things in JavaScript. They're used really frequently. Let's talk about what objects are and why we use them. Objects are collections of properties, and that sounds kind of confusing in that. So let's start with you think of an object as a person. So a person is an object, and that person has a collection of properties or a collection of attributes. So think about it, you have an eye color, a weight, an address. So if a person is an object, that person is always going to have a collection of attributes about them. If you think of a person, you are almost always going to assume that they have some attributes. So you're always going to assume that they have an eye color. Maybe you don't know which eye color it is, but you know they're going to have that attribute as well as a certain weight that they have, a hair color, a certain address. Then when you think about a car, you know a car is going to have certain attributes. So a car is not going to have a light, but a car is going to have a feature or a model name. So if you have a person object in JavaScript, you know that there are a bunch of attributes that are all related and pertaining to that person. Okay, so let's write out the name so we can give it some properties. Here is a JavaScript object. So we created it with var. So this object is name is last name, and now we're saying that this object is equal. And then inside it, we have a bunch of information about it. So this object is first one, first name, which says last name and last name. It contains age property, and age is 25. So these first two were strings, and now this is a number. And then the last property it contains an eye color, which is set to blue, which is my eye color. So think how useful this might be if you are writing a program and you want to be able to store an object Madison, and you want all of these different properties that I have to be saved, and you want them to be grouped together. So your program knows when it has this object Madison, it can point to all of these different properties that I have, and it remembers them all bundled together. So an object is really just a bunch of information about one thing bundled together. And this kind of makes sense for how we think about things in our life. So if you think about a person or a car or a dog, you know that each one of those things has a bunch of different attributes or properties that are all out an object and then define and give it properties that it has. So here's our object, and here's our collection of properties that this object has. Now, if this looks confusing here, we can look a little closer and see that the values above are written as name value pairs. That means that each attribute will have a name and then it's given a value. So here we have the attribute last name and it's given the value Ian. So if we were creating another object, say perhaps you are John, then here you would have first name is name, but the value over here would be something else, right? It would be John. Or here we have this name, eye color, and then we have a value that goes inside it. So eye color is the name of the property or the collection. So down here we have the name, eye color, and then the value inside it, which is blue, and these are each separated by commas. So here is one property, eye color, which is blue, and it's separated from this other property, which is last name, which is Canada. And so we can see if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, that this object Madison has 4 properties. Let's go on to the next section where we'll learn even more about objects in JavaScript, and then we will write some objects for ourselves. So we've been learning about objects in JavaScript. We know that they are collections of properties, but we want to know next, what can we do with these properties? How can we get access to them? And this is where we use dot notation and or property notation to get access to an object's properties. Let's look at some examples. So here we have an object being created called person, and we're just going to put nothing in that object right now. So these brackets with nothing inside them indicates that we've just created the variable person and it's an object, but it's empty. Next, we are going to use bracket notation to go into this person object and create a property. So we're going in and we're creating this property called first name, and we're saying the value inside of it is Madison. And then here we're going in doing the exact same thing. We're saying that the property is last name, and we're using bracket notation. That's what this is called, the brackets right here. And we're saying the value of last name is Canna. So we just created a name value pair, and we can do this on any object. So now the output of these, when you look again, say you console.log person, which you could go do right now in the JavaScript console, and you get this, the name value pairs that we've just created. So let's actually go test this. Let's just take these, go into our console right here, and go to the console. We see our screen we have there, and let's get some space. Just ignore that, and we're going to type these in. Okay, and now let's see person, and we see person is this object coming back to us. We created an empty object, and then we can see that inside of it, it has these 2 different properties. The first one is the property first name set to Madison, and the second one is the last name property with the value of Canna. Now, another way that we can access these properties or change them is using dot notation. So we can say, we have this person and we want to know what their first name is. So let's say person.firstname, and we output Madison. And this is incredibly valuable for when we're working with objects all the time as JavaScript developers. So we've learned a little bit about objects now and how we can use them. Let's go on to talking about something else called arrays. Now let's take a quick break and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, so we've been learning about objects and now we can also start talking about arrays in JavaScript. So an array is an object, but it's still a bit different. Some people would describe an array as the dumb version of an object, but there's actually a little bit more to it than that. So we use arrays to store single values in a single variable. So we've just learned about objects, and we know that objects are these collections of properties. But arrays, again, are used to store multiple values in a single variable. I say this twice because there's definitely a difference between what objects are and what arrays are. So let's just look at an example. Here we have the object, Madison, and I had the property of first name with the value of Madison and so on, as we saw. And then here we have an array. Now an array has several values inside of it. We just have this single variable of hobbies, and then inside we have many different arrays. So we just have this single variable, one variable called hobbies, and inside of it there's several values that are stored. There are no longer any name value pairs like we had with objects. There's just a bunch of values stored inside one variable. And that is the big difference between an object and array. So if we go look at even more of the documentation, we can learn more and more about arrays. And one of the things you can do is work with arrays. You can edit them, you can change them, you can create them or delete them. And in my job as a JavaScript developer, I'm using arrays all the time, and so understanding how they work is really important. We can go back to the JavaScript console and we can actually create an array right here. So we can create an array called var hobbies, like we had before. And then we can use these brackets to signify that this is going to be an array. And then we can just put a ton of values into here. So maybe your hobbies are reading, watching Game of Thrones. And if your hobby is not watching Game of Thrones, and this course was probably really annoying to you with all the little Game of Thrones references, so I apologize. Watching Game of Thrones, and we can have one more time with friends. Okay, now we can save that. And then if we want to go and see what this array has inside of it, we can simply write out hobbies, and then what's returned is all the values inside that array. Now we can access arrays in many different ways, which you'll learn about here, and in a similar way that we accessed objects and learned to use bracket notation, we can also do that here. So if we want to see what is the first value inside of hobbies, we can go 0, just like that. And now we're going to go into the hobbies array and find the first value. And of course, the first value is 0 here, because when we count in JavaScript, we start at 0. So 0 is 1. So there we can see inside of the first element in this array is reading. We can also add on things to arrays. We can delete them, add on, and later on when you're working more with code, you're going to go inside an array and do all sorts of more complex stuff with the elements in that array. And another thing that we can do is, just ignore that, we can create new arrays. So if we see this example that they have, we can enter this in here too. There are tons and tons of different methods and things that we can use to add on to our arrays, to change whatever's in the array, to delete the array, to do a lot of complex things. So we're always going to be working with arrays, especially as professional JavaScript developers. And so if we see the values inside of cars, we have those. But what if we want to add something inside there? So we can say cars.push, which is a method, and it takes in whatever we want to push into this array. So a new element we want to push in. So let's push in a Mustang. And now we can see the value inside of cars is 4. There's 4 elements in this array now. And if we see the value, we can see that Mustang has been added to the end. This is just the beginning of all the different things we can do with arrays. So let's go on to the next section where we talk about the classic for loop, which is a way that we can iterate over arrays and do things with them. Let's take a quick break and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, in the last section we learned about arrays, and now we're going to learn a bit about for loops. So if you're wondering why I'm in the documentation a lot and Googling different things, it's because I have spent a ton of time as a developer just Googling things, looking on Stack Overflow, and most importantly, reading the documentation. So getting familiar with going and looking at documentation, going through it, understanding it is really, really important. And I've been told this by all developers, from the senior developers I know who work as developers for 15 years to more junior developers who are maybe 6 months in. So documentation is really important. That being said, let's go on and look around for this JavaScript for loop. So we can see this right here. The JavaScript for loop is handy for executing a block of code a number of times. Now think about what a loop does. A loop can loop over the same thing over and over again. Now, there are many different kinds of loops, but one we can use is the for loop. Now, the for loop has actually been updated in ES6, but we're going to talk about that later on at the end of the course when we learn a little bit about ES6. If you don't know what that means right now, just ignore this. But if we go into the documentation right here, we can see that the for loop is often a tool you'll use when you're creating a loop, right? So this code can look confusing at first, but all it's saying is for, and then in these parentheses, we're going to put in the statements that we want. So we'll say, so statement 1 is executed before the loop, statement 2 is the condition for running the loop, and statement 3 is executed each time the loop has been executed. So let's create a variable called var sister calls. So it's going to have nothing inside of it right now, and we're going to create a for loop. And the goal of this for loop is every time your sister calls you, you answer the phone. So for every single time your sister calls, you answer your phone. And maybe in an app, this would be something else. Every time a user goes and clicks somewhere or does something, then you run another action. This is just used all the time. For loops or for each loops, which we'll learn about later, are constantly used in JavaScript in different ways. So let's say for, and then we have our three statements inside of here. So first of all, our sister calls, we're going to start them at 0. So for sister calls, we're starting the counter at 0. She hasn't called at all. And we're going to say every time she calls, we are going to do something. So let's say she calls less than 5 times. So she's going to call, sister calls less than 5 times. And every time she calls, we want to increase that count from 0 to adding the call on. So if she calls 0 times, it's 0, the count is 0. But if she calls 1 time, the count is now 1. So every time she calls, we're going to increase this counter just like that. And this is just saying that, she calls once and the counter is going to increase by 1, and sister calls will be equal to 1, and so on. And then we're going to finally have our curly brackets. So I'm holding down the shift key here when I press enter a couple of times, so I have some space. And now I'm going to say, what are we going to do when she calls? I'm going to write console.log answer your phone. So it's just a command that's going to run every time. Okay, now let's run this. Okay, and it's not working. Okay, so now let's look at our code. Nothing is happening, so we enter this in and it's not a function, so we don't need to call it. For some reason this isn't working. So let's get our code out again, and when we look at this example, we can see they're using a less than sign. So they're saying when steps are less than 5, and we're saying when sister calls are greater than 5. So let's actually change this to less than. And now, here we go, it's working. So that was kind of a bug of sorts. Even though there was no debugging error, our code just wasn't working, and that's pretty often occurring when you are a developer of any kind with any language. You're always going to be debugging a little bit. So don't get discouraged if it's just not working for you. You have to dig through a little bit and look carefully at your code. Okay, so back to this. So first our sister calls 0 times, but we are going through a loop here. So we're saying now, the bigger picture is, the sister calls and it starts at 1. And so the count is at 1 and we execute. Answer your phone. So for that call, we executed that. And then it goes on to 2, we execute it again, 3, 4, and 5. So when there's something happening several times, we're counting up from 0 to that number of 5, and we're executing this statement every single time. Now, if we went back and wrote this out again, and we said, for the sister calls less than 1, and we console log this, it's just coming out once, because the loop only ran once here, and that's the key. So up here, our for loop runs 5 times. It goes through the sister calls 5 times, and it goes from 0 to 5. So when it gets to the point where the count is 5, when your sister has called you 5 times, that's when you stop, because it's a less than sign here. So this is the fundamentals of how a for loop works. Now let's take a quick break and go on to the next section. Let's talk about functions. Let's talk about what they are, and then we're going to write some. Functions are reusable blocks of code, and this is really helpful for you as a JavaScript developer because you're going to be writing code all of the time, and a lot of it is code that you don't necessarily want to write twice. So you want to be able to write a block of code and then reuse it all the time. An example here is to think of a function as like a button. So you have a button on your TV screen, on your remote control. You press that button and say that button plays something. It's the play button. This play button will play any different kind of show. So it could play Game of Thrones, it could play the show Friends, it could play any kind of show. But if you were a JavaScript developer, imagine that you would have to rewrite the instructions for how to play a show every single time. You don't want to do that. Instead, you want to write a block of code that will play any sort of show and then keep reusing that block all the time. Here is just some pseudo code on the screen. So pseudo code is a way of writing a rough draft of your code, a brief outline of your code, but it's not necessarily the exact code you're going to write, it's just a draft. Now here we are actually creating a function called playMyShow. When we say var function, we're using the function keyword to create the function and then we give it the name of playMyShow. When you are writing a function, it's important to give your function a name that describes what the function does. So when other people are reading your code later, they could go quickly look at this and say, okay, this function is called play my show, so I know that this function, what it does is probably play a show. The next thing that we have are parameters. Inside of these parentheses right here are the parameters of your function. Now we want to use this function, going back to our idea of this button on your remote control, we want it to be able to take in any kind of show and then play that show. So this function plays a show, and it can take in any sort of show. We know the parameters are going to be the name of the show, which means we're writing this because later when we reuse this function, we want to know that it will take in the name of a show, and then its instructions will do something with the show to run the show, and then the output will be the playing show. The show will be on. If you think about an add function, a calculator app, the parameters will be two numbers. Now these two numbers can be any numbers, but in the beginning we just know that they're two numbers. Just like here, all we know is that this function is going to take in a show, the name of a show, and this could change later on. A function that adds two numbers together, say 2 plus 3, is going to take in these two numbers, 2 plus 3, adds them together inside of the instructions, and then returns the added numbers. So it will return 5. Again, inside of these curly braces, always inside of the curly braces, this is where we write the instructions for what our function will do. So this is just pseudo code and a comment right here. But later on we could have something that will make that show run. And lastly, inside of these instructions, we need the function to stop running and then shoot us back the output that we want. The return statement ends the function execution, and it specifies a value to be returned to the function caller. We have all these instructions in here, say that they're written out right here, and then when they are all done, we return the desired output we want. So we return show on right here. This is just pseudo code, but the idea is we return the output, which is the show is now turned on, which is what we want. Let's take a quick break and then go on to talk about how we can call a function. Okay, we've written our function, and this is just pseudo code, a comment here, but imagine there are instructions in here that are taking the name of the show and then running this show, and it returns, of course, the show that is on, so your TV show starts playing. But once we've written this function, how do we actually call it? Think about calling a function as the same way you press the button on your remote control. The button is there, we've created this button that will play the show, but how do we press that button? That's how we call a function. Here we have just the one line that you need to call your function. You write the name of the function, and then in parentheses you give it arguments. Up here we have the parameter, which is going to be what we expect the input of the function to be. We expect the input to be any kind of show name. And then down here we have the argument, which is a specific case of one show that you want to put into the function to get the output of that show, which would be Game of Thrones is now playing. Now imagine you hit that button and the play my show function runs. It takes in the input of Game of Thrones, it has instructions that turns Game of Thrones on, and then it outputs Game of Thrones to the screen. Calling your function is when you press that button. It's when you run your function. And this is why functions are so powerful, because you can press this button again and again, but with different arguments inside of it. So next time we could, again, say play my show, and next time we put in the argument of the show Westworld, because we just love HBO shows. This time in the parentheses, you enter in the argument of Westworld, and then the function runs again, but this time with the input of Westworld. It does something to turn Westworld on, and it returns to the screen Westworld is playing. Now, we've learned a lot about how functions work. Here is your function challenge. Okay, now here is your function challenge. Write a function that takes in two numbers and adds them. And your function should return the result of these two numbers added together. Okay, so you just completed your function challenge, and now I'm going to write out my solution to the add function. Now, if your code is written differently than mine, that's okay. So if you wrote an add function and it looks a little bit different than how my add function is written, that can be kind of normal. There's a lot of stylistic choices I have started to notice the more developers I work with, when you realize that people have different ways of writing code and different preferences. So in some ways there is the one best answer, function worked. Okay, and there we go. We can see if we scroll in here that our function is 5. Okay, so let's create another function, the same thing, but let's give it a different name. So var add 2 numbers. This could be another way of creating the same function but giving it a different name that is more explicitly written. So if you look at add the function, you're like, maybe that adds a couple numbers, maybe it adds 30 numbers, but if we look at the variable add 2 numbers, and that's a function called add 2 numbers, we're pretty sure that it's going to add 2 numbers. So we're going to say var add 2 numbers equal to function a, b. And this time, what we're going to do is skip creating the variable added, and we're going to immediately return a plus b. So our function here will immediately go in and return the value of a plus b. So if we take in 2 and 3, these will be added together and returned. Okay, now let's test the second one by calling it add 2 numbers. Oops, I had to write that. And again, this is camel case, and this is just kind of a rule we use in JavaScript when we are doing something like naming the function. Okay, so var 2 numbers. Okay, so add 2 numbers. Let's do 3 and 1. Let's do 3 and 1, and that should return 4. Okay, there we go. We can see clearly here by using the JavaScript console that our variable worked. Okay, and there you go. We can see here that our function add 2 numbers clearly worked, and it output the result of 4. So the second way of writing this function is just a different way that some people would say is a more clean way of writing this function, because we're immediately returning the result of these 2 numbers added together. And in this case, some would argue that we don't necessarily need to create an entire variable and store it when we can just more quickly return the value of these 2 numbers added together. Okay, that's all for now. Let's go on to the next video. We've just learned about functions, and we've actually written some functions, and now we're going to talk briefly about scope. When you are writing a function, oftentimes you will need to write a variable, create a variable within that function, and this is where scope comes into play. So variables can only be used in the functions they were defined in. In other words, when you create a function, you are going to oftentimes need to create variables that live inside that function and pertain specifically to that function. You may create a variable, defining that variable and assigning it to a value, and it's going to live inside of the function it was created in. So if you use that variable outside of the function, or you try to use it somewhere else in your code that's beyond that function, it's simply not going to work. Another way of saying this might be variables declared within a JavaScript function become local to that function. Now let's stop talking about it and go write a little bit of code to see if this helps us better understand what scope is exactly. We're going to go over to codepin.com, which is a great place where you can publicly share and host your projects. You can get a free account. We're going to go look at my account and see an example I have here of scope. So let's click into this, and I'm going to see I just have some JavaScript up on the screen. I also have HTML and CSS, but there's nothing there for now. And we're going to look at these 2 functions I've written out. So the first function is print dog name, and inside this function we declare this variable dog name and we assign it the value of Ruffy. And then the second line of this function is just simply writing out the dog name onto the screen. So when we call this function, what should happen is the name Ruffy should be written out here. And our second function is this print cat name. It is pretty much the same thing. We are defining this variable cat name, and then we are going to write it out. So let's call both of these first and to see if we get the expected values outputted onto the screen. So we're expecting to see Ruffy written out onto the screen and Whiskers. So right down here we are going to call the first function print dog name. So we're calling this, and we can see the value print out to the screen. So this function was created to define this variable and set it to the value of Ruffy, and then write it out onto the screen. And we can see that happening here. We can do the same exact thing with the second function. And we save it, and we can see these two functions are working correctly. So what happens if next we actually want to print out the value inside of dog name, and we want to print it out inside of this function? So inside of this function here, we're going to write document.write dog name. And we save it, and nothing is happening here. So you would expect for dog name to be outputting right after whiskers. It's going to come out onto the screen again. Just like if you would write cat name, save it, and you see again that cat name is being outputted twice. But when you do dog name and enter this in and press save, nothing's happening. Now why is this? This is where scope comes into play. So dog name was created up here inside of the print dog function. But this is an entirely separate function here, and this other function, print cat name, does not have access to the variable dog name. So this variable dog name here, it does not really exist, or it cannot be used outside of its scope, which is within this function. So dog name is local to this function, print dog name, and that's why it cannot be used outside of that function. This is a completely separate function over here. It is outside of that function. They don't have anything to do with each other. They're separate. And that is why dog name is not being used here. It's not working here because dog name's local scope is within this function. This is where it can be used. This is really where this variable lives. And because it does not live outside of this other function has no idea what to do with it. It just does no idea what dog name is. And this is the whole idea of local scope. So what would happen if we actually took this variable dog name and we put it outside of both functions? So we're going to go up here and we're actually going to write var dog name equal Ruffy. So we're rewriting this here, saving it. Okay, so now let's look carefully. Down here we have Ruffy, whiskers, Ruffy. And let's look at the code real quick. Here we have var dog name Ruffy, and then again we have our function which says print dog name. So this is the first printing to Ruffy right there. Next we're going to go into this function, and inside of it we have var cat name is created, and then it's written to the screen, cat name, which we see here in the middle, whiskers. And lastly we have document.write dog name, and again we see Ruffy is printed yet again. So what is happening? Where exactly is this variable? Now, this variable dog name was not created inside of any function. So this variable cat name was created inside of this function, and there's no variable at all created inside of this function. And the variable dog name is now created outside of any functions. So this means it has global scope, which means it can be used for either of these functions. So this function now, even though this variable dog name is not in the local scope of this function, it doesn't exist right here, this function has access to global variable. This actually is something that you never really want to do as a JavaScript developer, because if you give your variable global scope, then a lot of messiness can happen, and maybe you end up using a variable in a way that you didn't want to. So it's much better usually not to use global scope at all. But this is kind of an example of the differences between local scope and global scope. So you can think of a variable within a function as being locally scoped to that function and really just existing inside of that one function. Just like cat name here only exists within inside of function. And you can think of a global variable as one that can be used by any functions. Now let's take a quick break and go on to the next section. Now, making sure that you have Sublime downloaded onto your computer. You can go into it and open it, and then you can open the starter code. So if you've downloaded the zip file and unzipped it, and then you can click into it and just press open right here. So you've clicked into your starter app that you've downloaded the code for, you've unzipped it, and you've opened Sublime like this. And now we can click open here. And what happens is we have our starter app, all the code that we need, and everything that is included. So let's take a look at these files for a second. This is our index.html, where we have all of our HTML. A prerequisite for taking this course was just some basic understanding of how HTML and CSS works, so this should look pretty familiar to you. This is just a bunch of starter code. It's kind of a template of code I threw in here to make our app look pretty and to give our app some bare bones. So it's not too much in here when you get down to it, but we are going to see that we have these script tags in our index.html. And when we put these script tags in here, they are going to let us use JavaScript and Jquery, which we'll talk about very soon. So we're looking at all of this HTML, and you might notice that in earlier examples, we actually had JavaScript inside of our HTML. So earlier what we were doing was we had a bit of HTML maybe, and we could also put a script somewhere, end that script tag, and then, start to write our JavaScript right inside. And while that is possible, what we usually do in apps is we break up all of our code into different places and different sections. So in an app like this, and in many kind of basic starter apps, we will have the HTML in one section, we will have all of the CSS in others, so a ton of CSS here, which will make our app look good, and then we have a file that keeps the JavaScript, a library. In this case, we just have some jQuery. We're not really going to go into that file. It's just a library that we inserted in. And then we also have our app. And right now we can see that our app is empty because we've not written anything in it yet. Now, for really, really big apps, for the company that I work for example, the app is huge. There are tons and tons of these files, and there's many, many different places. So for example, there's one part of the app that maybe is the section for billing users, and that section can have tons and tons of different little pieces besides just one app.js file. But for a starter app like this, we can write all of our logic for our app, the JavaScript interactivity, inside this app.js file. So this is a pretty common format where we're separating out our JavaScript into this file. We're separating it away from the HTML and the CSS. One thing you might notice with libraries or frameworks later on is this is not always the case. So you're going to learn about lots of different things like the model view controller or how React works, and the ideas of how you organize your code can change. There's definitely different ideas about how we organize our code and what's the best architecture to organize code. So now that we've learned a little bit about the structure of this app, let's go on to the next section. Here is the app that we'll have completed by the end of this section. This is the Stark Search app. You can search anything into this app and your results will come back as Wikipedia results. Let's do an example here. Let's type in Jon Snow. When we type this in, we're going to get a list of results appearing onto your app. And you can click whichever one you want, which will take you over to a Wikipedia page that has all the information you need. You can turn back to your app, and we can refresh this page and type in anything we want. The Stark Search app does not necessarily just have to be Game of Thrones or Stark related. You can type anything you want into here. And results will come out, and you can pick through which ones you want. You can go here and choose this. The way we're going to build this app is by breaking it down step by step. A lot of HTML and CSS come into play here too. So if we refresh the app, what we see right here, all of this, is just the CSS and the HTML right now. So once we add in a user event, we search something in, and we get these results from Wikipedia returned back to our app, that is where all of the JavaScript comes into play. But in the next section, when you download the starter code for this app, you will see that it looks just like this, and it's really just a bunch of HTML and CSS. So already it looks like so much of our app is being made when we don't have the JavaScript yet. This is because, as we talked about earlier, we can think about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as all parts of our house. We can think of the HTML as the walls of our house, the CSS is the styling or perhaps what is making this image move right here, and the font color and size. whereas the JavaScript is the interactivity. So we're starting out with all of the HTML and CSS, but we do not have the interactivity. When you download the starter kit and you click here, nothing whatsoever will happen. Whilst later, we're going to add code and write JavaScript that will allow us to search something in here, click this button, and then get back those results, showing up as several different results that will appear on the screen. These results will be links that we will click and then be led to the relevant Wikipedia page that is about that result. Now, we're going to do all this by taking it step by step, very slowly, and looking at each little piece of how this works until we reach the final app, which you've just seen. Now let's go on to the next section and just do one first part of our app. Now, here's your first challenge. When this button is clicked in the starter app that you're about to download, nothing will happen. Find a way for, when this button is clicked, something on the screen to happen, an alert to appear that says button clicked. So try doing that, and then I'll show you what I've done. I'll see you in the next section. Let's start out our app by completing the simplest step that we can possibly do. So when a user clicks this button, nothing happens right now. There's no JavaScript whatsoever in our app, it's just a bunch of HTML and CSS looking nice right here. We want to create the very first step, which would be something happens when this button is clicked. This is called an event in JavaScript. So every single time you do something on your keyboard, you key up, you key down, you click a mouse, you double click, you right click. These are all different kinds of events in JavaScript. And you can write code that will decide what happens when you click a certain button or fill out a certain form. Now we're going to use a JavaScript library that is great for handling events. It's called Jquery, and it's been around for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about Jquery. Jquery is just a JavaScript library that makes writing JavaScript easier. So again, Jquery is just JavaScript. It makes your life much easier as a JavaScript developer when you are using Jquery. Today, there are a lot of different things you can use instead of Jquery, new things, libraries, and frameworks that have come out to use instead of Jquery. But we're going to learn a little bit of Jquery right now to understand more about user events and to keep learning just vanilla JavaScript and this JavaScript library. Now, when you see the $, you know that that's probably Jquery. And again, it's something that's going to help us handle the events we want to happen in our app right now. So let's stop talking about it and go make sure that Jquery is actually downloaded into our code. So I've already done this, but you can go Google download Jquery, and then you can insert the script into the bottom of your HTML in your app. I've already done it right here, and this actually enables us to use this Jquery library. So later on, when we go over to our app, we're going to use the Jquery library. You see this right here, we're going to use that over there. But we can only do this if we have the Jquery library right here in a script tag, installing it, letting us use it. So now that we have that done, we can actually start writing Jquery. Okay, now let's go over to our app where we have this first simple step that we're going to try to take. Create an alert that says button clicked when a user clicks the search button. Now, first we're going to go back over to our HTML document, and we're going to see that this button is inside of this form right here. So this button is inside of a form, and we ultimately want to write stuff in that form and click the button, and then have something happen once we've done both of those things. Okay, so let's go back over to our index.html, and we can see in this document that we have the button right here. Now, this button has classes on it, CSS classes. One of them is material icons to make it look nice, and the other one is the search button. So let's take that over to our app.js and just put it down here. So we know that when this button is clicked, we want an alert to appear that says button clicked. We're going to use Jquery to do this right now. We're going to use Jquery to help record this event, this clicking event happening, and then run code when it happens. So we'll use the $, and then inside of these parentheses, we're going to grab the search button class. So now we're selecting this by class, and then we're going to add the click method onto it. So now what we're doing is we're triggering an event on this class. So this class is of search button, which is attached to our button. And when our button is clicked, this click event is triggering. We are binding a JavaScript event to what is happening. So we're going to write out a function that takes in no parameters, and then curly brackets go inside and write something inside this function. We're now saying every time this button gets clicked, we're going to run this function. And this is an anonymous function, it doesn't need a name. But we know every time this button is clicked, this function gets run. So what do we want our function to do? Now this anonymous function is simply going to return an alert that says button clicked. Now we've saved this, we can delete this code right here. And let's go over to our app. Remember to refresh the page, and when we click this button, we expect an alert to pop up that says button clicked. So there we go, we see this alert popping up. So over here, we attached this event to this element. And we said whenever this event happens, whenever this user clicks this button, then this function will run. And inside this function, this alert runs. Now we've learned a little bit about jQuery and how we're going to use it to help us control what happens when the user clicks a button in our app. Now let's take a short break and then go on to the next section. Okay, so we've seen a little bit of how we do this stuff, and now we're going to think about writing out our function. Now this function will have a lot in it. It's going to be kind of a small function, but depending on where you're starting from, it can seem huge at first. So we're just going to create the bare bones of this function. We want this function to essentially get that Wikipedia data. So whatever we put into our input form, whatever search string we put into there, we want this function to take that search string and not only output it onto the screen, but give us these relevant Wikipedia links. So we're going to be using the Wikipedia API somehow. So we want this function overall to display the Wikipedia data, right? So we could say we want it to be called var display Wikipedia data. And we're going to say the equal sign function. It's not going to take in any parameters right now. It could later, we don't know yet. And then we're going to have our curly braces, hit enter, and then all the code inside of here will be the bulk majority of our Ajax call, which we'll talk about in a second, and how we're going to take that and append it to this screen. So lots of stuff going on in here, lots of logic, but we're going to piece it out one by one. So we know we want this function to somehow, once we enter in a search string, say we enter in the string, Jon Snow, we want somehow to go get all the Wikipedia results on Jon Snow, bring back the first 10 results, output them to the screen, and not only have those first 10 results on the screen, but have them be clickable links. So whatever the first result is for Jon Snow, it will say the title of that Wikipedia result, and then we can also click on that result and go to that page. And again, this search string Jon Snow can change. So every time we refresh the page and we enter in new text into that input field, our wiki data will be different because it'll constantly be changing. We can search in anything we want, not just Game of Thrones related, it could be all sorts of stuff. Now we have our display Wikipedia data function, and we know we need to do a couple of different things inside of this function, but one of the things that's really important for us to do is actually get this Wikipedia data. So we simply have this app right now, right? We have a couple of different things inside of this app. And in this app, we have our JavaScript, we have our HTML, and then our CSS files. But how do we go over to Wikipedia, get that data that we want, and then put it onto our page? We're going to learn about Ajax requests. Now, Ajax requests really stand for asynchronous JavaScript requests. Asynchronous JavaScript is incredibly important to JavaScript. Now, a lot of what JavaScript is making asynchronous JavaScript requests. It's a huge part of being a JavaScript developer. No matter if you are a junior or a very senior developer, understanding that core concept of asynchronous JavaScript and what that means is really important. So let's take a quick break, and then we're going to go on to the next section where we talk all about asynchronous JavaScript and making our Ajax request. Okay, so JavaScript is asynchronous. What does that really mean? Now in our app, what we're going to do is we're going to make a request to go get that Wikipedia data, and we're going to send that data back to our app. Let's take a break and then go on to the next section. In this section, we're going back to our split screen view, which I had up earlier in the course, which has on the right my Sublime text editor open with the app open and our progress so far. And then on the left, I have my Google Chrome browser open to this page right here. So one thing we can do real quick to make this look a little bit nicer is go to our Sublime settings and click Word Wrap. Because right now we can see our code over here is kind of going off the screen. And when we click Word Wrap, all of our code will wrap around to however open the screen is, and we can see it all right here. So essentially, whatever amount Sublime is open on the page, you can see all of your code right there. And this is just handy now because we can minimize our page even more and we see that our code is still going to appear on the screen. Whereas before, when we had Word Wrap turned off, this setting was turned off, we couldn't see some of the code on our screen, which would cause us to scroll left and right. Which is a nice trick you can do, one of the many things that Sublime and other text editors offer to make your writing code easier. Another thing we can do is hide this sidebar because we're just going to focus completely on this app.js file in this section. So we can go to our view and click hide sidebar and that will disappear. So we have a little more room here. Now, this page is open right here and this is how we're going to start making our Ajax request. This is again in Jquery and we're using the Ajax method, and what this does is it performs an asynchronous Ajax request. And you can actually see this right here. In the description, it's going to perform this asynchronous HTTP request. Now, what do we need in this request so far? We definitely need just the outline of this Ajax method, and we can start going through this code and looking at examples of it. So let's begin to write our Ajax method, and we are going to write it inside of our function. So because this function is called the display Wikipedia data function, we want to somehow get that Wikipedia data, and we know that we want our Ajax request to do this for us. And so we're going to put our Ajax request inside of this function because that's kind of where it belongs. If you think about getting this Wikipedia data and then displaying it, Ajax is doing that for us, so it's going to live inside of here. This is a handy way of deciding what should go inside of your functions because again, if you think about what a function really does, say a function it says open web page, then you imagine that every time that function runs, it opens a web page. And so here, we're displaying the Wikipedia data and we're also going to get that data, so our Ajax request will go inside. So we need to write out our Ajax method like this. And then we're going to put code inside of it. So here's our Ajax method, and we're going to begin putting things right here. Now, if you want to understand a little bit more about in-depth why we're using this Ajax method with Jquery, I'm going to provide this link right here, and it kind of talks a little bit more about why we're using the Ajax methods with Jquery. And as it talks about, the cool thing about this is we can load external data, like the data from the Wikipedia API, into selected HTML elements of our web page. So, where are we sending this request that we're making? We're going to send it over to some sort of Wikipedia URL because we somehow want to get that URL, get that data there, and bring it back to us. So this URL needs to contain the URL that has something to do with Wikipedia, and that's where our request is sent. So if we want to type something into our app and then have it return with the Wikipedia article about that something, then we need a Wikipedia URL that is somehow attached with the search query or the search string that we're going to input every time we use our app. And if we go down to the URL examples, we can see that this is how they're formatted. Right now, we don't know what our URL is going to be, so we're just going to leave that alone. We also need to have a data type right here to specify what kind of data are we going to get back. Now, if this sounds confusing, then we can look up more documentation in other places to see different examples of how we can learn this. So let's stop for one moment before we go on and take a look at some more documentation on Jquery Ajax methods. So let's briefly just look at this. And sometimes going on and looking at this more, reading through, helps you have a better understanding. So I'm going to provide the link in the resources. And here we can see more about jQuery Ajax methods. So Ajax is the art of exchanging data with a server and updates parts of a web page without reloading the whole page. So when we type something into our app, say Jon Snow, our Ajax request is going to go and get that data that we want, get those articles about Jon Snow from Wikipedia, and bring them back to our app without reloading our whole page. So our app is going to be really fast. And here we're going to use the Ajax method because it performs this asynchronous Ajax request. Now let's take a quick break, and I'll see you in the next section as we continue creating our Ajax request. Okay, jumping back into where we left off, here is a quick code challenge for you. Go through the documentation on this page and look for a function that we can use that will run when an Ajax request successfully completes. So when our Ajax request successfully completes, we want to run a function that does something. So here are a list of methods, and look for what this function could be. And as a refresher, a method is simply an action that can be run on an object. Or in other words, an object can have different properties. So remember, we had iColor is blue, and a method is a function on that object. Say that is the person object, and they have this attribute or property which is iColor blue. Say they also have this speak function on them, and this causes them to speak, right? So if this is a method and we're placing it inside whatever this Ajax thing is, then what is this Ajax thing? So we know what it does, but what is it? So this right here, this is an object, and what we're doing right here is we're putting settings onto it. So again, we have this person object who has eyes that are blue, and they have the action of speaking. And similarly, we have this object, and we're going to put a URL on it, and then we're going to put a method on it, which is just an action. So a method is a function that's attached to an object, and on this Ajax object, we want to put some sort of action that when the Ajax object performs successfully, when the asynchronous request is successful, we want that function to run. We want that action to happen. So the Ajax object does its job and it goes, awesome, okay, and then we want to run a function that happens. And that is why we want to look for some sort of method that will run when our Ajax request successfully performs. So this Ajax request performs, and then we want to do something there, right? We want something to happen when it does perform. We want to take the results of a performance and use it in our app. Okay, we're going to look for that, and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, here's what I did for the last challenge. I found the Ajax success method. Say that 5 times fast. And we'll actually switch this to a comma for now because there is going to be another setting now. So we use this success method, and here is our function that runs. So essentially what we're doing is we're placing this success setting onto our Ajax object. And we're saying that when this asynchronous request completes successfully, then this function will run. So upon success, this function will run. Maybe it can be as simple as a console log for now that says, yay, success. Our Ajax request worked. Okay, so what can we take in to the parameters of this function? And again, the parameters are the input that the function takes in. A function takes in some sort of input, it changes it somehow, and then it brings it out as an output in some different form. So you can go look at the Ajax success method, and there's actually different ways that we can use this, but this is what we did here as one of the options to make it a setting. And what we're going to do is we're going to put in the parameters of res. And this can also be written as response, but we're going to shorten it to res as is commonly done. Okay, so what does this mean? Now this function is taking in a response. the Ajax request runs and it comes back and it's successful. Okay, so this code is saying now, once we know that it's successful, do something. This function is going to do something, but it needs to take in the successful response that is sent back. Again, the entire point of this Ajax request is to go get some sort of data we need and then return it to us. So when it's successfully returned, our function takes in that successful response, that data, and it does something with it. And that is why we're going to use res, or response, as the parameter that our function takes in. Now, let's take a quick break and put aside our Ajax request for a moment while we talk about the Wikipedia data itself and how we're going to get it and do something with it inside of this function. I'll see you in the next section. Okay, now we have our app running again. It open in the index.html file, and over here we are back to our app.js file with our index.html file up over here. Like I said, we are going to pause for a second on making our Ajax request. So we have this function and this Ajax request, and we have this URL, and then this other setting, which is when the Ajax request successfully comes back, then we're going to run this function that takes in the response and does something with that response. So we actually know that we're going to output the results of the Wikipedia data on the screen, with links and other things, but for now we can just leave that there roughly. So we can get rid of this, and we know that that's what we want to happen when we get our Wikipedia data back. We want to output those results back onto the screen, and we also want to have those results be titles of each of the different Wikipedia articles with links that you can click on those titles and go to that Wikipedia page. But again, let's draw back from this for a moment, because for now it looks like we have everything we need here, and now we should focus on, okay, how do we actually get this Wikipedia data? Now, before we start figuring out how we can do that Wikipedia API call, and again, the word API sounds kind of complicated and scary, but all it really means is, okay, someone built something, and you built an app, and then you can have an API that says, okay, how do you interact with this app? So for example, you can go to reddit.com and you will see that there is a bunch of YouTube videos embedded right there in one of the Reddit feeds, right? And so Reddit used YouTube's API to put their embedded YouTube videos back into Reddit, if that makes sense. So that's just a brief aside, but we need to use that Wikipedia API, and we're just going to pause there, and we're going to figure out the next smallest step we can do besides getting that Wikipedia data. So what do we know? What's happening right now is this button is still showing up, but that's not going to be super useful to us because we don't want that button to output onto the screen. That's not going to be super useful to us because we don't really care about this alert. What we care about is the input that a user puts in. So when we write Jon Snow, we want to somehow go get all of the articles about Jon Snow when you search into Wikipedia and bring them back here. Let's start with the first smallest step. When we enter Jon Snow into here, we want this result to show back in our console. So here we have the console, and nothing is happening when you type in Jon Snow. So let's get rid of this alert that we no longer need and save it. Okay, so let's create a variable called our search string, or just search string, and let's make that variable have the value of whatever we put in our input form. So we are actually going to go and grab the ID of this input element, and if the ID is not there, we're going to create it, and we're going to use it. Now, if this seems a little bit confusing at first, we're going to write some code to clear it up for ourselves a little bit better. So first we want to go to the input. That's where we're typing in our search string. We can just search for it in here, input, and here we have it. And we're going to give it an ID. And we're going to say its ID is equal to search string. And now we're going to use Jquery to go select that ID So now we can do things with this HTML element because we are selecting with jQuery that ID. We want this input element, right? And we're going to use jQuery to select this element by its ID, which is search string. But once it's selected, or once we have that HTML element, we're going to write JavaScript or jQuery, and depending on what we make that code do, this HTML element is going to change. And because we've selected it with jQuery by its ID, we can do this. So let's create a variable up here. So we're going to say var search string is equal to, and of course this doesn't really mean equals to, but it means this variable search string holds the value inside of it of, and then we're going to use jQuery, something inside of here. Now inside of our variable search string, we want to get that HTML input element whose ID we are selecting by. So remember, we have that HTML element, we have that input, and we want to select by its ID to get it and use it here. So we can do this by writing out its ID, search string. And then lastly, we're going to use the val method, or the value method. So we're going to say .val, and then because it is a method, it needs to have these parentheses, to run a function in that way. And we're going to use this because we can see when we go look at its documentation, which I will link to, it's used a lot with HTML forms, and it returns or sets the value attribute of the selected element. So when we use this, that means that we want to get the value out of this input form. So if we type in dog into the input form, we want search string to now be equal to dog. So we're getting that value inside the input form. But speaking of the form, right now we're really only working on the input. So let's delete this and go look again at our HTML. Our input has an ID now, but our form does not. Our form is not really being selected over in the jQuery. So right now, even though this should be working where we type something into the input form and then we get back out its value in the console, this is actually not going to work right now, and you can go and try it yourself. And this is not going to work because just because we type something in, nothing is happening. We need a way to execute it, to press this button, submit the form, and then have our code run. So what we need to do next is create an ID for our form. So we can see ID is equal to just form. And then we need to say every time we hit that form, that button which is connected to the form, we need this function to run. How do we do this? So this is your next code challenge. Try to find something that will bind this function to the user event of clicking that button. So we want to submit that form and then have this function get run somehow. Try to find what we could use here, and I'll see you in the next section. Okay, so I found this submit method, and the description of it is it binds an event handler to the submit JavaScript event or trigger that event on an element. We want to put this submit method on our element form that we got by its ID. We're going to take in a handler, which is our function, and that function runs every time the form is submitted, or in other words, every time the event is triggered. So first we can go and again get our form by its ID using jQuery, like this, and then we attach the submit method .submit, and then we know that it takes in a handler or a function, and this function will run every single time this form is submitted. And of course we want it to take in our display Wikipedia data function, so we can write it in right here. So now we're taking in this function, the display Wikipedia function. We can save this, and another thing we can do here is let's actually take our search string variable and put it inside of our function. We want to do this because before, if we go back by hitting Command Z a couple of times, we had our variable search string and it was a global variable, so it was not inside anything. This can be pretty bad because global variables leak a lot, and so maybe if your app gets bigger and bigger, you don't want a variable that can be available everywhere. You want to be safe and secure with your variables, And so we can put this in here because it's just a better way to store our variables, and we can get in the habit of saying, this is our greater overall function, and this variable search string, we really only want to use it inside of this function, so let's place it in here. And it's also a way of being more organized with our code. So we have our function, we have our Ajax request coming together inside of that function, and now every time we hit that form, it is going to run this function. But we still don't have any Wikipedia data that is somehow coming back to us. So let's begin to construct our Wikipedia URL. Now this would be kind of the same if we did this. We can go over to Wikipedia, click inside it there, and we can search anything. So our usual example of Jon Snow. And we can see all of these examples coming up on wikipedia.org. So we have Jon Snow, the character, the journalist apparently. You've probably just heard of the Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. We have the cricket player, the physician down here. So the question is, how on earth do we take our search bar that we have right here? And nothing's really going in right now. We have a lot of test things. How do we take this and somehow write code so that these search results appear on our app? We want this exact thing to happen. Okay, so for this, we need to use the Wikipedia API. Using its API is a fancy way of saying we want to interact with all of the data in Wikipedia. We were going to use it, write code around getting that data and displaying it back in our app and using it in our app. So let's go look at the Wikipedia API. Now the Wikipedia API is on MediaWiki, that's just the owner of Wikipedia. And we can start to see when we read through here, we're beginning to see what we need to construct this URL. So we need an endpoint. This is the place we're going to make our API call to. All this means is we're making our request, we're making that call, we're going and getting that data from that point, and we're bringing it back to us. And we have examples here already. Now, if we want to look a little bit more specifically, we can go and look at Stack Overflow. If you haven't heard of Stack Overflow before, you will soon, or you may have already heard about it. Of course, here's some ads for JavaScript jobs that are always popping up. But Stack Overflow is a place where you can post your programming questions, and the great answers, the best answers, are voted up. So here's someone who wants to do exactly what we want to do. They want to use a Wikipedia API to search for values input by user. Now, we've already kind of done this, but not quite, and they're going to have an example of how we're using our URL. So we can go down to the answer, and it's been upvoted, and we can see that here is the URL that these people have constructed. It's a URL that's equal to the wikipedia.api, and then there's an action called open search. And so what does this URL even mean? So first we have that string of wikipedia/w.api, and then it's saying the action of it is open search and search. So the action of this URL is going to be searching, right? Because we want to search through and find the data for whatever search string we put in. So here it says the API entry point. That's the URL to which we make our API calls. So we're making our API call to this endpoint. This URL is the endpoint, and that's all that it is. And then next, we just need, secondly, our parameters. So our search term can be a parameter. Basically, we are specifying what do we want from our API. So then we can look at the rest of the parameters here. So we have an action parameter, which you can see here. Our action parameter is open search and search, and it's used to search all over Wikipedia. We can read more about the action parameter over here as well. So here we have this link, and then we are saying search equals plus search term. Now what the heck is this? This is going to be our own search string variable. So we have this search string variable, and that is going to go inside our URL. So when we make that API call to Wikipedia, we are taking into account that search string and whatever it is. So if we type Game of Thrones, that is going to specifically go search Wikipedia for our search string, which is Game of Thrones. And then lastly, we have added on our format. Now, like this says, our format tells us which format we want our results in. We are going to use JSON. JSON is really just a really good readable format for reading data, and it's really important we use JSON because a JavaScript object can be turned into JSON and sent over to the server. So it's really just a way of getting and receiving information that works for us, the server, and the browser. You can read more about it if you'd like, but for now we know that this is the format we want to be in. And lastly, we see the callback parameter. And we're seeing something here that says callback may have been added in your query to trigger a JSON-P response to avoid violation of the same origin policy. Essentially, this means that we need to use JSON-P, which is just like JSON, but it has a bit of differences. We need to use JSON-P in our callback request. So we can use JSON-P by going over and adding another property to our Ajax object. And this time we're going to specify the data type, and we're going to say that our data type is going to now be JSON-P. So we're not going to go too far into what JSON-P is because I have not had to use it too much. It's just an important part of making our API call for this specific app. But we're going to go back and make sure we have this data type of JSON-P. And then we also need to say the name of the parameter, which is the callback. Okay, so let's put those right there and continue on. So a lot of the times what we're doing is working with new frameworks and libraries, and I do oftentimes copy a little snippet of code, or I go look up documentation in different places. All of the time, I look at that code and how it's written, and then I look at that as kind of a rough draft, and then you modify it later on to really fit your needs, as long as you're understanding really what every bit of that does. So let's comment this out and begin to construct our own URL. Now we can call this a Wikipedia URL, and the value inside is going to be this endpoint right here with parentheses. And next we are going to concatenate, so we're concatenating this together. Now this variable Wikipedia URL, this has a value of one long string. So if you're wondering like, there's a URL and then there's this variable we're going to put in, and then even more here, all we're doing is constructing together a URL. So you could take this URL and go use it on the internet and you would see all of the data. So we type in Denarius and we're going to go to that API endpoint, get all the data on the search results of Denarius and bring them back to us. And we're using the variable of search string because we want it to change every time. So we're going to concatenate our own variable search string. And lastly, we are going to trigger our JSON-P to avoid that cross-browser reference we were talking about by writing out something very similar to what we see here. Actually identical. Okay, and then a semicolon in the end. Let's get rid of this code. Save this. And lastly, with this variable of Wikipedia URL that we've constructed, we can make it the value of this URL property. So we have this URL property inside of our Ajax request, and we could make the value inside of it be the Wikipedia URL. So just like we said that we wanted to have some sort of URL, some sort of endpoint in here that we go grab data from, now we're just saying that this right here is going to be equal to this URL right here. So the value inside of this property of URL is what we just created. Now we can go on to the final step of what are we going to do with these results when they come back. We have this Ajax request and it's taking in a certain data type, it's taking in this URL, this endpoint that we've constructed, and it's getting back whatever data matches the search results of our search string, which is attached to our input. So we can type in anything random we want and we're going to go search Wikipedia to get the results that come up, and our callback is going to be that wiki callback. So I've written this console.log here, and this is the part where everything should be working now, but we want to slow down and think, what are we actually returning from here? And instead of going and running to the next step and thinking, okay, how on earth can I somehow put this data onto the screen in an organized and nice fashion, we can just slow down and think about how can we start to prove that our data is even coming back to us and check that this whole thing is working. So what if we just console.logged res, which is our response? So again, we go into this form, we write out Jon Snow, we go and make an API call to this API endpoint, and we're searching for the search string, which has the value of Jon Snow now. And then when this successfully happens, when this Ajax request is successful, we're running this function that will then give us back the results that we're looking for. So let's take a quick break and come back in the next section and finish this up. So now we have the response from our data right in here, and we're going to want to console.log it so we can see if there's a response happening. So this should run every time we submit this form, and we should get some data back about whatever search string that we put in. But we want to test this, so we're just going to start off not by rushing to try to put this response somehow in our code, somehow make it on the screen, but we're just going to console.log it for ourselves to see. And we can actually get rid of this space here because we don't need that. If this response does not go through, what happens? We don't really have anything saying what's going to happen. So we can write return false right here. So we want to write this here because we just want to have this line and say, okay, if these conditions are not true, then we want to return false. So we're writing this because we need to check when this data comes back that it's matching all of these conditions we have, and if not, we're returning false. So if that does not match, those conditions don't match, we're returning false. Okay, so let's save this and let's go back to trying our app. It's really important to stop right now and test this out. Okay, so let's go back over to our app and let's hit refresh. Let's open up the console because right now there's nothing that's going to actually output onto the screen. Go over to the console right here and let's type something in. So we've done this a million times now, but let's type in Jon Snow. And now we're going to submit this form by clicking the button, and we see something is appearing back in our console. So we're just doing a console log of the response, which means that our Ajax request was successful. So we've console.logged our response, and now there is something showing up here, which is really great news for us. Now we can also go over to our network, and we can see our API call has successfully worked. And if we refresh this page, actually, we'll go down here, and we can see our API call happening when we submit this form. So we can type in Jon Snow again, hit this button, and you see this appear. And the status of 200 is saying that your Ajax request was successful, which is really awesome news for us. So we have the preview here, we have the response, which is kind of the same thing, but in this format. So we're getting a ton of stuff back once we make our Wikipedia API call, and that is awesome news for us. Now we can see in our preview here, or we can go back over to the console, that it looks like we're getting all of these different things. We're not quite sure what this is yet. So let's look into these arrays and see what they are, what's going on here. Now all we did was console.log the response. We're getting all the data pertaining to this search result of Jon Snow from, I was going to say Jon string. We're getting all these results back from the Wikipedia API that we just made a call to. So first we can see this first one, and it has a bunch of results inside of it. Now this might look familiar to you as we talked about earlier. So this first array holds a ton of results in it, and if we go back over to Wikipedia and we search for Jon Snow again, we can see that it's bringing up some of the first several results when we search for Jon Snow. So we have the character, journalist, the cricketer, am I saying cricket right? And then if we go here, we're seeing this exact same thing coming back to us. We're seeing Jon Snow, character, journalist, and cricketer. And this is exactly what we want. So we want, when we're searching, we want the first several results for whatever Jon Snow could be to come up. So say we search for Bitcoin. So we can go down here to see the next search results coming into us. And we're seeing several of the Wikipedia articles about Bitcoin. And then what is next here? What is the second one? Now we're seeing all of the different descriptions. Now in this third array, we're seeing all of the different links. So there's many, many different responses we could go grab and use. And the one we want to use is this first array right here. We want to have on our screen, like we said, a list of all of the results that happen when you search for something. So when you search for Jon Snow, all of these several results come up, and we want to have those out on our page, and we also want to be able to click to one of the results. So when you search in Jon Snow, we want to have Jon Snow come up, then Jon Snow the character, Jon Snow the journalist. We want to have those on our page, and we want to be able to click those and make them go to that exact Wikipedia article that we're clicking on. So in order to do this, we're going to modify our console.log a little bit by changing it up. So first we're going to make a variable called linked lists. So essentially we want to put out a list of these onto the screen, and we want them to be links. So we're just going to call this variable link lists, and we're going to set this equal to the response. But we're going to go into this response object and we are going to take the array that we want. So we want all of these, which is the first array in here. So we're going to use bracket notation and we're going to say 1. Now, bracket notation is very similar to dot notation. Either of them can be used, and we talked about them a little bit earlier. So now we are going to save that, and now our console response is going to be linked list. And that's just kind of the same thing, but now the variable linked list is equal to the first array in that response. Okay, so let's refresh our page. Everything's gone away. Let's go back to Jon Snow. And here we are getting exactly what we need, this first array. Now, one thing I want to point out real quick that might be confusing is if we go back, save this, run Jon Snow, why are you thinking, why is this the first array? It's clearly not. This is the first array. In a lot of programming languages, the count starts at 0, and that's why that's like that. Okay, so let's go back, add back this stuff. I'm just using Command-Shift-Z, which isn't the best practice right there, but I just wanted to use that to go back and show you that real quick. Here we can see we're getting back all of the exact responses that we want. We're getting back, in particular, all of these responses, and now the only really next step to do is we want to take each response, put it onto the screen, and then include a link that will click to the article of that. So similarly to how we search Jon Snow here, Wikipedia already has these links that you can click on, and we want to make something similar to this with a clickable link. So we can click on Jon Snow the character, and our app is going to redirect us to this page. So let's take a quick break and go on to completing the very last part of this function, which will be somehow creating a way that we can go through each one of these lists and append it onto the screen, as well as adding a link that matches that particular article. Okay, so go try to find a way that we can do exactly that, and I'll see you in the next section. Back over here on our app, we can search our Jon Snow again, search string, and we can see all of these coming back to us. But we want to go in here and take each one of these items and somehow output them onto the screen with a link. So you may have found different ways to do this, but one of the ways you may have found to do this is to use the for loop. So the for loop looks something like this. For I equals 0, I less than, something dot length, link list dot length, and so on. Okay, let's stop all that. So, not that. We're gonna stop this for a second because this is a for loop and it's definitely been used before, you might see it. But there's something newer and better that we're gonna use besides the for loop. So we're gonna take a brief aside to talk about something called ES6. Okay, so we have JavaScript. We know JavaScript is a programming language, but what the heck is ES6 and how and why are we going to use it right now to finish writing our app? ES6 is the current implementation of JavaScript. Now what the heck does this mean? JavaScript has changed over the years. There are a group of people that decide how we can make JavaScript even better, and this means modifying the language. So a brief example we're going to look at is an arrow function. So back inside our app, we are going to very quickly use ES6 here. Now, we have always had this function keyword. Let's move in a little bit here. We've always had this function keyword, and it's always been there to signify that this is a function, and we've always had this, but with ES6 and with newer implementations of JavaScript, there's been several new updates. We decided, okay, what if we use something besides the function keyword? Because programmers maybe don't want to write out the word function every single time. So we decided to use the fat arrow. The fat arrow looks like this. See, it's kind of that fat bar right there. That's why it's called the fat arrow. And some people call it the fat arrow anyways. But it can also be called the arrow key, of course. And we use this instead of the word function. So when you write a function now with ES6, you can simply go like this. You take out the word function, just completely delete it, and then to the right of the parameters, you can write. And so this now signifies that this is a function. So this is ES6. It's really just updated JavaScript, and it's a way where people, really smart people, get together and go, okay, how can we make JavaScript even better to write, even easier to write? So now we can go back to just leaving this as it was, and we can start to think about our for loop, and we're going to use something called the for each helper. So it's an array helper, because right now we're getting back this array, but we want to use something called the for each helper to go over every item in that array of results. So we're going to use it right now. We're going to say linked list dot for each. So with ES6, for any array that we have, like this array right here, we have access to this for each helper. When we use this for each method, it takes in an anonymous function. So we can write out function right here. Now this function gets called one time for every single element in the array. So the elements in this array that we want to get access to, we can call them items, or an item. This function will get called for every single one. So it's getting called for every single one. We can go over here, make our first curly bracket, and this is basically saying now, what do we want to happen when this function is called on every single item? Well, for now, what if we just console.log and see each item go out onto the screen? So we're already getting each item in this list that we want. So real quick, let's just comment this out and we'll go see what we had before. So you type in Jon Snow right here, and we're getting back this array, but now we want to actually try this out and see if each item console.logs to the screen. So let's get rid of this old console.log, we don't need it, and go test this out. So we are going to refresh the page and then type in Jon Snow. Perfect, and we see this function, was run each time for each item in this search that we're getting back with our Ajax call. And so now we want to just take these and put them onto the screen. So let's do that. Let's go over to our index.html and let's create a place for our links to be at. So we're going to create some new divs here. Links container. So this will be a place where we have all of our links. And inside of that, we are going to make a list that has an ID of link, and we can also have the class of link so we can make it look nice with our CSS. And then we're going to simply close it. That should be a UL like that. And then close the div. So if we're back to our app, we are going to just delete this console.log right now because we no longer need it. And we're going to start writing something else that will allow us to output all of our article results onto the screen and make them into links as well. Now, I've already created this for us. This is our links element, and we want to be able to use this. So we've gotten this element with Jquery, selecting it by its ID, so now we can use it. So what we want to do next is, for each item, we want to append that onto the screen. So we're going to have a list on the screen, and that's why we created our UL div. And for each item that comes back with our Ajax request that sends it back, we want to append that item onto the screen, and specifically we want to append it inside of our list of links. So let's just do that. Let's go use Jquery again and grab our links element, and then let's use the append method and append something onto that links element. And of course we are going to append the item. So the append method will take in that item and it will append it onto this links element. Let's save this and go see if this works. Okay, we're back in our app and we can refresh this real quick. And now let's type in something and hit enter. Okay, now we can begin to see all of the results we want are now being output onto the screen. So we're going and getting that data with our API request, and then we're bringing it back to our own screen. And this is really just the foundation of how so much about the web and using JavaScript works. So if we go back to here and we do a console.log again of our link list, right? And then go back to our app and refresh the page, do Jquery again, we can see that not only these results are outputting up there as we want them, but they're right here. So it's the exact same thing is now showing up on the screen. And we can refresh this and put out anything we want. So let's go get the results for Jon Snow again. We've done that a ton. There they are. This is the Wikipedia API, so our Stark Search app, doesn't need to be just for Game of Thrones related, although you could certainly make it that as a more advanced feature in your app, but this could be absolutely anything in the world. So instead of just appending this item, let's leave this alone for a second and just delete that, and let's create a variable to store our item in. Now, we don't want this item just to be an item. We actually want it to be a URL that has the name of the item, but then it's also clickable. So let's create a variable and let's call it URL, and we know that it's going to include the item. But we also want it to concatenate something else. We want it to concatenate that link that we want to click to. So we can use strings right here to create a URL that has whatever URL we need and then our item concatenated. So imagine this item is Jon Snow, right? That's the item that we are getting back from the server because that was our search string. So all we need here is the URL for the Wikipedia article of Jon Snow. And it's not just Jon Snow, but for each item, we want the exact URL for that Wikipedia article. So if you type in the word water, you might get one URL that has the first result that says ocean, and then another item will come back that maybe says rivers, and you want each one of those to have a link that goes to that specific item. So let's just see another example of this so we know exactly what we mean. When we go to a certain page, so let's go to Elon Musk page, we can see this URL right here. And that says wiki/Elon Musk. Now if we go back again and we type this and we go to another link here, the second one, it has a different separate link. So this goes to Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster. So if we go back to our app, we can actually put in the first part of that link. So we can just take this part, and then this is not going to be our search string, but this is going to be one of the many results that come back because of our search string. So just like how in here we searched in Elon Musk and we got a ton of different things, we want to, just like Wikipedia does, go and get each one of the links to these specific articles. So we're going to say for each item, there is going to be that URL, which will take you to the correct article for that Wikipedia page. So they're going to have that URL plus that item, which is going to be the name of that item, right? So let's save that and see what happens. Save it, go back to our app, refresh, go back to our typical classic example, search, and oof, we get a bunch of this stuff. So we're getting the URL where we need to go, which is good. So the first one's Jon Snow. The second one is a Jon Snow maybe character, but the problem is this all looks terrible. The good news is, at least, is that it works. So one of the last results when you search Jon Snow on Wikipedia, it's not just the character, it's all of these different things. There's a journalist called Jon Snow, right? And what you can find is this URL we've constructed is working. So we can actually take that, even though it maybe doesn't look like a URL, and we go and put it into our Google, and it goes directly to that relevant article. All we need to do is clean this up now, and we'll do this by using not only these variables, but we're also going to use some HTML to make these look better. So first we're going to write out a div that's going to be a list, and we can put that at the very end too and close it. So we're going to make them into a list, which is going to look really good. Closing list. And the next thing we want to do is make this URL and these words, put them together into a link. So we can do this by just writing a simple href tag with, of course, the last, like this. And then right after the URL, we want this tag to close. So we're going to write another concatenation, and we're going to write the closing of that tag. So this right here is saying the URL is going to be this clickable thing, and we want to click to that relevant page. And lastly, we want to end this tag, and we can end it right after the item. So the item is just going to display the name of whatever item that came out, Jon Snow the character, Jon Snow the journalist, or the cricketer. And when you click on it, it's going to have this URL that takes you over to that relevant search results. So we're just going to finish this up by writing in the closing tag for the href tag. So closing it, and now we're going to save it. And now lastly, what we can do is we're going to say return the URL. So this function is going to return this URL to us. And it's going to take in each of these items, and for each item the function is going to fire that will create on the page all of the names of these items as well as clickable links on this page. Now let's save this and then go try it out in our app. So we'll refresh the page, type in something we've put in before, and then we're getting nothing. Okay, so let's go to our developer tools and look inside the console. And now we see we're getting this error, uncaught syntax error, on line 15. We don't really know what this means, so let's just go back and look at line 15, which is right here. Now we can see that inside of this links element, we're appending things. So we're appending this list div, we're appending this link, and then here we want to concatenate this, which looks like the add symbol, to URL. But we can actually see right here that we're not doing this. So what with URL here, we're adding it to the ending of this href tag right here, this link, but we're not actually concatenating them here. So we need to add a plus sign here. And if we continue going through our code, we can see that again, we're concatenating item, but then here, we're actually not concatenating it to the last bit, the closing of this list and the closing of this ref tag. So we actually need to go to our item and add another concatenation to actually say that item is now being concatenated to this as well, and now this should fix it. Okay, here we are back in our app. It's the moment of truth. Let's see if this is working now. Let's type in Denarius and hit search, and there we go. The final result that we've built our entire function around getting. We typed in Denarius and we get several of the first results that show up on Wikipedia when you enter this in. And now let's start clicking. So we can go to Denarius and we can see that this takes us to the article of Denarius. Now if we go back, let's refresh our page and try something else. Let's go to another mythical world here and type Harry Potter. And we're going to see all of these results that we could get for Harry Potter on Wikipedia. So we have Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. We can click to it and we're led to this Wikipedia page. Okay, now that is our app. We can try different things too, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. And we can see that everything is working exactly how we wanted in the beginning. And that is our app today. So congratulations on finishing this app. Let's go on to the next section and begin to wrap up. Now let's talk about one last thing. The whole idea of this app was to get you really familiar with how an Ajax request works. And as I've said, knowing how to understand that, because it's asynchronous JavaScript, is a huge part of being a JavaScript developer. Now, I want to talk about why learning how to do this Ajax request is going to help you with everything that you learn going forward in the next section. So let's go on to the next section and I'll see you there. Okay, in the last section, we finished building our app, which was pretty awesome, and we really learned a lot about asynchronous JavaScript. And the reason why we've centered a ton of this course around making that Ajax request is that asynchronous JavaScript and understanding how that request worked is the core of JavaScript programming. It's why JavaScript is so powerful today. And so if you're a JavaScript developer, you are always going to be working with and understanding that idea of asynchronous JavaScript. So if you can understand that core idea of how asynchronous JavaScript works, that's going to be really helpful for you as a developer. And if you want a refresher, you can go back over earlier where we really talked about the core idea of what asynchronous JavaScript means. Now here is more good news. We just learned about Ajax requests, but if you started to get involved with the JavaScript scene, you may have heard of all of these other things like async await and promises. So you're thinking, well, gosh, I didn't learn about any of those today. Well, if you understand the core idea of an Ajax request, which was here before all of these other updates, then you can also really understand the core idea of how both of these work. Now, async await and promises, these are just new things, updates to the JavaScript language that make it easier and easier for you to use asynchronous JavaScript, for you to make Ajax calls. I'm going to link an article more about this, but the good news is you can go on to understand all of this other stuff if you understand the core idea of asynchronous JavaScript. So congratulations on learning more about the fundamentals of JavaScript and how it really works. Let's go on to the next section where we wrap up. Congratulations, we've just built our first app. Again, we can see we can type whatever we want into here. Jon Snow. Get the results back with our Ajax request and be able to click these and go into the Wikipedia articles that we want. We can click back to our app and see that we've completed the functionality we wanted to have. There are so many different next steps you can next do. You can build this app out even more and give it greater functionality. You can jump into learning about a framework. You can specifically learn about Node or React or Angular. Or you can just continue deepening your understanding of some of the fundamentals of JavaScript. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations on jumping into learning JavaScript. No matter what you felt at different parts of this course, whether you felt it was really hard or whether you felt it was very easy in moments, whatever you felt, you can take whatever level you're at and push yourself to learn even more. So if certain things feel hard, you can go over them again and review them. If some things feel too easy, you can go on and challenge yourself with more courses or simply with building more stuff. Whatever you do, I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to JavaScript, and I hope you build a lot of really incredible stuff soon. Please let me know what you want added to this course, or what you thought about this course, or anything else that I can help you with. Thanks so much for taking this course. I'd love to hear your thoughts or how I can further help you in your journey to becoming a JavaScript developer.